Glenarvan went back to Thalcave, who stood beside Thayuka with his arms crossed, looking quietly at the troubled waves. Glenarvan took his hand and, pointing to the yacht, said, "Come." The Indian gently shook his head. "Come, friend," repeated Glenarvan. "No," said Thalcave gently. "Here is Thayuka, and there, the Pampas," he added, embracing with a passionate gesture the wide-stretching prairies. Glenarvan understood his refusal. He knew that the Indian would never forsake the prairie, where the bones of his fathers were whitening, and he knew the religious attachment of these sons of the desert for their native land. He did not urge Thalcave longer, therefore, but simply pressed his hand. Nor could he find it in his heart to insist, when the Indian, smiling as usual, would not accept the price of his services, pushing back the money and saying, "For the sake of friendship." Glenarvan could not reply, but he wished at least to leave the brave fellow some souvenir of his European friends. What was there to give, however? Arms, horses, everything had been destroyed in the unfortunate inundation, and his friends were no richer than himself. He was quite at a loss how to show his recognition of the disinterestedness of this noble guide, when a happy thought struck him. He had an exquisite portrait of Lady Helena in his pocket, a chef 500 over of Lawrence. This he drew out and offered to Thalcave, simply saying, "My wife." The Indian gazed at it with a softened eye and said, "Good and beautiful." Then Robert and Paganel and the Major and the rest exchanged touching farewells with the faithful Patagonian. Thalcave embraced them each and pressed them to his broad chest. Paganel made him accept a map of South America and the two oceans, which he had often seen the Indian looking at with interest. It was the most precious thing the geographer possessed. As for Robert, he had only caresses to bestow, and these he lavished on his friend, not forgetting to give a share to Thayuka. The boat from the Duncan was now fast approaching, and in another minute had glided into a narrow channel between the sandbanks and run ashore. "My wife," were Glenarvan's first words. "My sister," said Robert. "Lady Helena and Miss Grant are waiting for you on board," replied the coxswain. "But lose no time, your honor, we have not a minute, for the tide is beginning to ebb already." The last kindly adieus were spoken, and Thalcave accompanied his friends to the boat, which had been pushed back into the water. Just as Robert was going to step in, the Indian took him in his arms and gazed tenderly into his face. Then he said, "Now go, you are a man." "Goodbye, goodbye, friend," said Glenarvan once more. "Shall we never see each other again?" Paganel called out. "Quinsabe, who knows?" replied Thalcave, lifting his arms toward heaven. These were the Indian's last words, dying away on the breeze, as the boat receded gradually from the shore. For a long time, his dark, motionless silhouette stood out against the sky, through the white, dashing spray of the waves. Then by degrees his tall form began to diminish in size, till at last his friends of a day lost sight of him altogether. An hour afterward Robert was the first to leap on board the Duncan. He flung his arms round Mary's neck, amid the loud, joyous hurrahs of the crew on the yacht. Thus the journey across South America was accomplished, the given line of march being scrupulously adhered to throughout. Neither mountains nor rivers had made the travelers change their course, and though they had not had to encounter any ill will from men, their generous intrepidity had been often enough roughly put to the proof by the fury of the unchained elements. End of Book 1. In Search of the Castaways, or The Children of Captain Grant. Australia. Chapter 1, A New Destination. For the first few moments, the joy of reunion completely filled the hearts. Lord Glenarvan had taken care that the ill success of their expedition should not throw a gloom over the pleasure of meeting, his very first words being, "Cheer up, friends, cheer up. Captain Grant is not with us, but we have a certainty of finding him." Only such an assurance as this would have restored hope to those on board the Duncan. Lady Helena and Mary Grant had been sorely tried by the suspense, as they stood on the poop waiting for the arrival of the boat and trying to count the number of its passengers. Alternate hope and fear agitated the bosom of poor Mary. Sometimes she fancied she could see her father, Harry Grant, and sometimes she gave way to despair. Her heart throbbed violently. She could not speak, and indeed could scarcely stand. Lady Helena put her arm round her waist to support her, but the captain, John Mangles, who stood close beside them, spoke no encouraging word, For his practiced, I saw plainly that the captain was not there. He is there, he is coming. Oh, father, exclaimed the young girl. But as the boat came nearer, her illusion was dispelled. All hope forsook her, and she would have sunk in despair but for the reassuring voice of Glenarvan. After their mutual embraces were over, Lady Helena and Mary Grant and John Mangles were informed of the principal incidents of the expedition, and especially of the new interpretation of the document, due to the sagacity of Jacques Paganel. His lordship also spoke in the most eulogistic terms of Robert, of whom Mary might well be proud. His courage and devotion, and the dangers he had run, were all shown up in strong relief by his patron, till the modest boy did not know which way to look, and was obliged to hide his burning cheeks in his sister's arms. "No need to blush, Robert," said John Mangles. "Your conduct has been worthy of your name." And he leaned over the boy and pressed his lips on his cheek, still wet with Mary's tears. The Major and Paganel, it need hardly be said, came in for their due share of welcome, and Lady Helena only regretted she could not shake hands with the brave and generous Thalcave. McNabb soon slipped away to his cabin, and began to shave himself as coolly and composedly as possible, while Paganel flew here and there, like a bee sipping the sweets of compliments and smiles. He wanted to embrace everyone on board the yacht, and beginning with Lady Helena and Mary Grant, wound up with M. Albinett, the steward, who could only acknowledge so polite an attention by announcing that breakfast was ready. "Breakfast?" exclaimed Paganel. "Yes, Monsieur Paganel. A real breakfast, on a real table with a cloth and napkins." "Certainly, Monsieur Paganel. And we shall neither have charqui, nor hard eggs, nor fillets of ostrich." "Oh, monsieur," said Albinett in an aggrieved tone. "I don't want to hurt your feelings, my friend," said the geographer, smiling. "But for a month that has been our usual bill of fare, and when we dined we stretched ourselves full length on the ground, unless we sat astride on the trees. Consequently, the meal you have just announced seemed to me like a dream, or fiction, or chimera." "Well, Monsieur Paganel, come along and let us prove its reality," said Lady Helena, who could not help laughing. "Take my arm," replied the gallant geographer. "Has his lordship any orders to give me about the Duncan?" asked John Mangles. "After breakfast, John," replied Glenarvan, "we'll discuss the program of our new expedition en famille." M. Albinett's breakfast seemed quite a fate to the hungry guests. It was pronounced excellent, and even superior to the festivities of the Pampas. Paganel was helped twice to each dish, through absence of mind, he said. This unlucky word reminded Lady Helena of the amiable Frenchman's propensity, and made her ask if he had ever fallen into his old habits while they were away. The Major and Glenarvan exchanged smiling glances, and Paganel burst out laughing, and protested on his honor that he would never be caught tripping again once more during the whole voyage. After this prelude, he gave an amusing recital of his disastrous mistake in learning Spanish and his profound study of Camões. "After all," he added, "it's an ill wind that blows nobody good, and I don't regret the mistake." "Why not, my worthy friend?" asked the Major. "Because I not only know Spanish but Portuguese. I can speak 2 languages instead of 1. "Upon my word, I never thought of that," said McNabbs. "My compliments, Paganel, my sincere compliments." But Paganel was too busily engaged with his knife and fork to lose a single mouthful, though he did his best to eat and talk at the same time. He was so much taken up with his plate, however, that one little fact quite escaped his observation, though Glenarvan noticed it at once. This was that John Mangles had grown particularly attentive to Mary Grant. A significant glance from Lady Helena told him, moreover, how affairs stood, and inspired him with affectionate sympathy for the young lovers. But nothing of this was apparent in his manner to John, for his next question was what sort of a voyage he had made. "We could not have had a better, but I must apprise your lordship that I did not go through the Straits of Magellan again." "What, you doubled Cape Horn and I was not there?" exclaimed Paganel. "Hang yourself," said the Major. "Selfish fellow, you advise me to do that because you want my rope," retorted the geographer. "Well, you see, my dear Paganel, unless you have the gift of ubiquity, you can't be in 2 places at once. While you were scouring the Pampas, you could not be doubling Cape Horn." "That doesn't prevent my regretting it," replied Paganel. Here the subject dropped, and John continued his account of his voyage. On arriving at Cape Pillars, he had found the winds dead against him, and therefore made for the south, coasting along the Desolation Isle, and after going as far as the 67th degree southern latitude, had doubled Cape Horn, passed by Terra del Fuego and the Straits of Le Maire, keeping close to the Patagonian shore. At Cape Corrientes, they encountered the terrible storm, which had handled the travelers across the Pampas so roughly. But the yacht had borne it bravely, and for the last 3 days had stood right out to sea, till the welcome signal gun of the expedition was heard announcing the arrival of the anxiously looked-for party. It was only justice, the captain added, that he should mention the intrepid bearing of Lady Helena and Mary Grant throughout the whole hurricane. They had not shown the least fear, unless for their friends, who might possibly be exposed to the fury of the tempest. After John Mangles had finished his narrative, Glenarvan turned to Mary and said, "My dear Miss Mary, the captain has been doing homage to your noble qualities, and I am glad to think you are not unhappy on board his ship." "How could I be?" replied Mary naively, looking at Lady Helena and at the young captain too, likely enough. "Oh, my sister is very fond of you, Mr. John, and so am I," exclaimed Robert. "And so am I of you, my dear boy," returned the captain, a little abashed by Robert's innocent avowal, which had kindled a faint blush on Mary's cheek. Then he managed to turn the conversation to safer topics by saying, "And now that your lordship has heard all about the doings of the Duncan, perhaps you will give us some details of your own journey, and tell us more about the exploits of our young hero." Nothing could be more agreeable than such a recital to Lady Helena and Mary Grant, and accordingly Lord Glenarvan hastened to satisfy their curiosity, going over incident by incident, the entire march from one ocean to another, the pass of the Andes, the earthquake, the disappearance of Robert, his capture by the condor, Thalcave's providential shot, the episode of the Red Wolves, the devotion of the young lad, Sergeant Manuel, the inundations, the caimans, the waterspout, the night on the Atlantic shore. All these details, amusing or terrible, excited by turns laughter and horror in the listeners. Often and often Robert came in for caresses from his sister and Lady Helena. Never was a boy so much embraced or by such enthusiastic friends. "And now, friends," added Lord Glenarvan when he had finished his narrative, "we must think of the present. The past is gone, but the future is ours. Let us come back to Captain Harry Grant." As soon as breakfast was over they all went into Lord Glenarvan's private cabin, and seated themselves round a table covered with charts and plans, to talk over the matter fully. "My dear Helena," said Lord Glenarvan, "I told you, when we came on board a little while ago, that though we had not brought back Captain Grant, our hope of finding him was stronger than ever. The result of our journey across America is this. We have reached the conviction, or rather absolute certainty, that the shipwreck never occurred on the shores of the Atlantic nor Pacific. The natural inference is that, as far as regards Patagonia, our interpretation of the document was erroneous. Most fortunately, our friend Paganel, in a happy moment of inspiration, discovered the mistake. He has proved clearly that we have been on the wrong track, and so explained the document that all doubt whatever is removed from our minds. However, as the document is in French, I will ask Paganel to go over it for your benefit." The learned geographer, thus called upon, executed his task in the most convincing manner, descanting on the syllables Goni and Indi, and extracting Australia out of Austral. He pointed out that Captain Grant, on leaving the coast of Peru to return to Europe, might have been carried away with his disabled ship by the southern currents of the Pacific right to the shores of Australia, and his hypotheses were so ingenious, and his deductions so subtle that even the matter-of-fact John Mangles, a difficult judge, and most unlikely to be led away by any flights of imagination, was completely satisfied. At the conclusion of Paganel's dissertation, Glenarvan announced that the Duncan would sail immediately for Australia. But before the decisive orders were given, McNabbs asked for a few minutes' hearing. "Say away, McNabbs," replied Glenarvan. "I have no intention of weakening the arguments of my friend Paganel, and still less of refuting them. I consider them wise and weighty, and deserving our attention, and think them justly entitled to form the basis of our future researches. But still, I should like them to be submitted to a final examination, in order to make their worth incontestable and uncontested." "Go on, Major," said Paganel. "I am ready to answer all your questions." "They are simple enough, as you will see. 5 months ago, when we left the Clyde, we had studied these same documents, and their interpretation then appeared quite plain. No other coast but the western coast of Patagonia could possibly, we thought, have been the scene of the shipwreck. We had not even the shadow of a doubt on the subject." "That's true," replied Glenarvan. A little later, continued the major, when a providential fit of absence of mind came over Paganel and brought him on board the yacht, the documents were submitted to him, and he approved our plan of search most unreservedly. "I do not deny it," said Paganel. "And yet we were mistaken," resumed the major. "Yes, we were mistaken," returned Paganel, "but it is only human to make a mistake, while to persist in it, a man must be a fool." "Stop, Paganel, don't excite yourself. I don't mean to say that we should prolong our search in America." "What is it then that you want?" asked Glenarvan. "A confession, nothing more. A confession that Australia now as evidently appears to be the theater of the shipwreck of the Britannia as America did before." "We confess it willingly," replied Paganel. "Very well then, since that is the case, my advice is not to let your imagination rely on successive and contradictory evidence. Who knows whether after Australia some other country may not appear with equal certainty to be the place, and we may have to recommence our search." Glenarvan and Paganel looked at each other silently, struck by the justice of these remarks. "I should like you, therefore," continued the major, "before we actually start for Australia, to make one more examination of the documents. Here they are, and here are the charts. Let us take up each point in succession through which the 37th parallel passes, and see if we come across any other country which would agree with the precise indications of the document." "Nothing can be more easily and quickly done," replied Paganel, "for countries are not very numerous in this latitude, happily." "Well, look," said the major, displaying an English planisphere on the plan of Mercator's chart, and presenting the appearance of a terrestrial globe. He placed it before Lady Helena, and then they all stood round, so as to be able to follow the argument of Paganel. "As I have said already," resumed the learned geographer, "after having crossed South America, the 37th degree of latitude cuts the islands of Tristan da Cunha. Now, I maintain that none of the words of the document could relate to these islands. The documents were examined with the most minute care, and the conclusion unanimously reached was that these islands were entirely out of the question." "Let us go on then," resumed Paganel. "After leaving the Atlantic, we pass 2 degrees below the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean. Only one group of islands is found on this route, the Amsterdam Isles. Now then, we must examine these as we did the Tristan da Cunha group." After a close survey, the Amsterdam Isles were rejected in their turn. Not a single word, or part of a word, French, English, or German, could apply to this group in the Indian Ocean. "Now we come to Australia," continued Paganel. "The 37th parallel touches this continent at Cape Bernouilli and leaves it at Twofold Bay. You will agree with me that, without straining the text, the English word straw and the French one austral may relate to Australia. The thing is too plain to need proof." The conclusion of Paganel met with unanimous approval. Every probability was in his favor. "And where is the next point?" asked McNabbs. "That is easily answered. After leaving Twofold Bay, we cross an arm of the sea which extends to New Zealand. Here I must call your attention to the fact that the French word contin means a continent, irrefragably. Captain Grant could not, then, have found refuge in New Zealand, which is only an island. However that may be, though, examine and compare and go over and over each word, and see if, by any possibility, they can be made to fit this new country." "In no way whatever," replied John Mangles, after a minute investigation of the documents and the planisphere. "No," chimed in all the rest, and even the major himself, "it cannot apply to New Zealand." "Now," went on Paganel, "in all this immense space between this large island and the American coast, there is only one solitary barren little island crossed by the 37th parallel." "And what is its name?" asked the major. "Here it is, marked in the map. It is Maria Theresa, a name of which there is not a single trace in either of the 3 documents." "Not the slightest," said Glenarvan. "I leave you then, my friends, to decide whether all these probabilities, not to say certainties, are not in favor of the Australian continent." "Evidently," replied the captain and all the others. "Well then, John," said Glenarvan, "the next question is, have you provisions and coal enough?" "Yes, your honor, I took in an ample store at Talcahuano, and, besides, we can easily replenish our stock of coal at Cape Town." "Well then, give orders." "Let me make one more observation," interrupted McNabbs. Go on then. Whatever likelihood of success Australia may offer us, wouldn't it be advisable to stop a day or two at the Tristan da Cunha Isles and the Amsterdam? They lie in our route and would not take us the least out of the way. Then, we should be able to ascertain if the Britannia had left any traces of her shipwreck there. Incredulous Major, exclaimed Paganel, he still sticks to his idea. I stick to this anyway, that I don't want to have to retrace our steps, supposing that Australia should disappoint our sanguine hopes. It seems to me a good precaution, replied Glenarvan. And I'm not the one to dissuade you from it, returned Paganel, quite the contrary. Steer straight for Tristan da Cunha. Immediately, Your Honor, replied the captain, going on deck, while Robert and Mary Grant overwhelmed Lord Glenarvan with their grateful thanks. Shortly after, the Duncan had left the American coast and was running eastward, her sharp keel rapidly cutting her way through the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. Chapter 2: Tristan da Cunha and the Isle of Amsterdam. If the yacht had followed the line of the equator, the 196 degrees which separate Australia from America, or, more correctly, Cape Bernouilli from Cape Corrientes, would have been equal to 11,760 geographical miles. But along the 37th parallel, these same degrees, owing to the form of the Earth, only represent 9,480 miles. From the American coast to Tristan da Cunha is Recon, 100 miles, a distance which John Mangles hoped to clear in 10 days if east winds did not retard the motion of the yacht. But he was not long uneasy on that score, for toward evening the breeze sensibly lulled, and then changed altogether, giving the Duncan a fair field on a calm sea for displaying her incomparable qualities as a sailor. The passengers had fallen back into their ordinary ship life, and it hardly seemed as if they really could have been absent a whole month. Instead of the Pacific, the Atlantic stretched itself out before them, and there was scarcely a shade of difference in the waves of the two oceans. The elements, after having handled them so roughly, seemed now disposed to favor them to the utmost. The sea was tranquil, and the wind kept in the right quarter, so that the yacht could spread all her canvas, and lend its aid, if needed, to the indefatigable steam stored up in the boiler. Under such conditions, the voyage was safely and rapidly accomplished. Their confidence increased as they found themselves nearer the Australian coast. They began to talk of Captain Grant as if the yacht were going to take him on board at a given port. His cabin was got ready, and berths for the men. This cabin was next to the famous number 6, which Paganel had taken possession of instead of the one he had booked on the Scotia. It had been till now occupied by M. Albinett, who vacated it for the expected guest. Mary took great delight in arranging it with her own hands and adorning it for the reception of the loved inmate. The learned geographer kept himself closely shut up. He was working away from morning till night at a work entitled Sublime Impressions of a Geographer in the Argentine Pampas, and they could hear him repeating elegant periods aloud before committing them to the white pages of his daybook. And more than once, unfaithful to Clio, the muse of history, he invoked in his transports the divine Calliope, the muse of epic poetry. Paganel made no secret of it either. The chaste daughters of Apollo willingly left the slopes of Helicon and Parnassus at his call. Lady Helena paid him sincere compliments on his mythological visitants, and so did the Major, though he could not forbear adding, "But mind no fits of absence of mind, my dear Paganel, and if you take a fancy to learn Australian, don't go and study it in a Chinese grammar." Things went on perfectly smoothly on board. Lady Helena and Lord Glenarvan found leisure to watch John Mangles' growing attachment to Mary Grant. There was nothing to be said against it, and, indeed, since John remained silent, it was best to take no notice of it. "What will Captain Grant think?" Lord Glenarvan asked his wife one day. "He'll think John is worthy of Mary, my dear Edward, and he'll think right." Meanwhile, the yacht was making rapid progress. 5 days after losing sight of Cape Corrientes, on the 16th of November, they fell in with fine westerly breezes, and the Duncan might almost have dispensed with her screw altogether, for she flew over the water like a bird, spreading all her sails to catch the breeze, as if she were running a race with the Royal Thames Club yachts. Next day, the ocean appeared covered with immense seaweeds, looking like a great pond choked up with the debris of trees and plants torn off the neighboring continents. Commander Murray had specially pointed them out to the attention of navigators. The Duncan appeared to glide over a long prairie, which Paganel justly compared to the Pampas, and her speed slackened a little. 24 hours after, at break of day, The man on the lookout was heard calling out, "Land ahead." "In what direction?" asked Tom Austin, who was on watch. "Leeward," was the reply. This exciting cry brought everyone speedily on deck. Soon a telescope made its appearance, followed by Jacques Paganel. The learned geographer pointed the instrument in the direction indicated, but could see nothing that resembled land. "Look in the clouds," said John Mangles. "Ah, now I do see a sort of peak, but very indistinctly." "It is Tristan da Cunha," replied John Mangles. "Then, if my memory serves me right, we must be 80 miles from it, for the peak of Tristan, 7,000 feet high, is visible at that distance." "That's it precisely." Some hours later, the sharp, lofty crags of the group of islands stood out clearly on the horizon. The conical peak of Tristan looked black against the bright sky, which seemed all ablaze with the splendor of the rising sun. Soon the principal island stood out from the rocky mass, at the summit of a triangle inclining toward the northeast. Tristan da Cunha is situated in 37 degrees 8 of southern latitude and degrees 44 of longitude west of the meridian at Greenwich. Inaccessible Island is 18 miles to the southwest and Nightingale Island is 10 miles to the southeast, and this completes the little solitary group of islets in the Atlantic Ocean. Toward noon, the two principal landmarks, by which the group is recognized, were sighted, and at 3 p.m. the Duncan entered Falmouth Bay in Tristan da Cunha. Several whaling vessels were lying quietly at anchor there, for the coast abounds in seals and other marine animals. John Mangle's first care was to find good anchorage, and then all the passengers, both ladies and gentlemen, got into the long boat and were rowed ashore. They stepped out on a beach covered with fine black sand, the impalpable debris of the calcined rocks of the island. Tristan da Cunha is the capital of the group, and consists of a little village lying in the heart of the bay and watered by a noisy, rapid stream. It contained about 50 houses, tolerably clean and disposed with geometrical regularity. Behind this miniature town there lay 1,500 hectares of meadowland, bounded by an embankment of lava. Above this embankment, the conical peak rose 7,000 feet high. Lord Glenarvan was received by a governor supplied from the English colony at the Cape. He inquired at once respecting Harry Grant and the Britannia, and found the names entirely unknown. The Tristan da Cunha Isles are out of the route of ships, and consequently little frequented. Since the wreck of the Blendenhall in 1821, on the rocks of Inaccessible Island, two vessels have stranded on the chief island, the Primate in 1845, and the three-mast American, Philadelphia, in 1857. These three events comprise the whole catalogue of maritime disasters in the annals of the Acunhas. Lord Glenarvan did not expect to glean any information, and only asked by the way of duty. He even sent the boats to make the circuit of the island, the entire extent of which was not more than 17 miles at most. In the interim, the passengers walked about the village. The population does not exceed inhabitants, and consists of English and Americans, married to Negroes and Cape Hottentots, who might bear away the palm for ugliness. The children of these heterogeneous households are very disagreeable compounds of Saxon stiffness and African blackness. It was nearly nightfall before the party returned to the yacht, chattering and admiring the natural riches displayed on all sides, for even close to the streets of the capital, fields of wheat and maize were waving, and crops of vegetables, imported 40 years before, and in the environs of the village, herds of cattle and sheep were feeding. The boats returned to the Duncan about the same time as Lord Glenarvan. They had made the circuit of the entire island in a few hours, but without coming across the least trace of the Britannia. The only result of this voyage of circumnavigation was to strike out the name of Isle Tristan from the program of search. Chapter 3: Cape Town and Mviet. As John Mangles intended to put in at the Cape of Good Hope for coals, he was obliged to deviate a little from the 37th parallel and go 2 degrees north. In less than 6 days, he cleared the 1,300 miles which separate the point of Africa from Tristan da Cunha, and on the 24th of November, at 3 p.m., the Table Mountain was sighted. At 8 o'clock, they entered the bay and cast anchor in the port of Cape Town. They sailed away next morning at daybreak. Between the Cape and Amsterdam Island, there is a distance of 2,900 miles, but with a good sea and favoring breeze, this was only a 10 days' voyage. The elements were now no longer at war with the travelers, as on their journey across the Pampas, air and water seemed in league to help them forward. Ah, the sea, exclaimed Paganel. It is the field par excellence for the exercise of human energies, and the ship is the true vehicle of civilization. Think, my friends, if the globe had been only an immense continent, the thousandth part of it would still be unknown to us, even in this 19th century. See how it is in the interior of great countries. In the steppes of Siberia, in the plains of Central Asia, in the deserts of Africa, in the prairies of America, in the immense wilds of Australia, in the icy solitudes of the poles, man scarcely dares to venture. The most daring shrinks back, the most courageous succumbs. They cannot penetrate them. The means of transport are insufficient, and the heat and disease and savage disposition of the natives are impassable obstacles. 20 miles of desert separate men more than 500 miles of ocean. Paganel spoke with such warmth that even the Major had nothing to say against this panegyric of the ocean. Indeed, if the finding of Harry Grant had involved following a parallel across continents instead of oceans, the enterprise could not have been attempted. But the sea was there ready to carry the travelers from one country to another. And on the 6th of December, at the first streak of day, they saw a fresh mountain apparently emerging from the bosom of the waves. This was Amsterdam Island, situated in 37 degrees 47 minutes latitude and degrees 24 minutes longitude, the high cone of which in clear weather is visible 50 miles off. At 8 o'clock, its form, indistinct though it still was, seemed almost a reproduction of Tenerife. And consequently it must resemble Tristan da Cunha, observed Glenarvan. A very wise conclusion, said Paganel, according to the geometrographic axiom that two islands resembling a third must have a common likeness. I will only add that, like Tristan da Cunha, Amsterdam Island is equally rich in seals and Robinsons. There are Robinsons everywhere, then, said Lady Helena. Indeed, madam, replied Paganel, I know few islands without some tale of the kind appurtening to them, and the romance of your immortal countryman, Daniel Defoe, has been often enough realized before his day. Monsieur Paganel, said Mary, may I ask you a question? Two, if you like, my dear young lady, and I promise to answer them. Well then, I want to know if you would be very much frightened at the idea of being cast away alone on a desert island. I, exclaimed Paganel. Come now, my good fellow, said the Major, don't go and tell us that it is your most cherished desire. I don't pretend it is that, but still, after all, such an adventure would not be very unpleasant to me. I should begin a new life, I should hunt and fish. I should choose a grotto for my domicile in winter and a tree in summer. I should make storehouses for my harvests. In one word, I should colonize my island. All by yourself? All by myself if I was obliged. Besides, are we ever obliged? Cannot one find friends among the animals and choose some tame kid or eloquent parrot or amiable monkey? And if a lucky chance should send one a companion like the faithful Friday, what more is needed? Two friends on a rock, there is happiness. Suppose now, the Major and I. Thank you, replied the Major, interrupting him. I have no inclination in that line, and should make a very poor Robinson Crusoe. My dear Monsieur Paganel, said Lady Helena, you are letting your imagination run away with you as usual. But the dream is very different from the reality. You are thinking of an imaginary Robinson's life, thrown on a picked island and treated like a spoiled child by nature. You only see the sunny side. What, madam? You don't believe a man could be happy on a desert island? I do not. Man is made for society and not for solitude, and solitude can only engender despair. It is a question of time. At the outset, it is quite possible that material wants and the very necessities of existence may engross the poor shipwrecked fellow, just snatched from the waves. But afterward, when he feels himself alone, far from his fellow men, without any hope of seeing country and friends again, what must he think, what must he suffer? His little island is all his world. The whole human race is shut up in himself, and when death comes, which utter loneliness will make terrible, he will be like the last man on the last day of the world. Believe me, Monsieur Paganel, such a man is not to be envied. Paganel gave in, though regretfully, to the arguments of Lady Helena, and still kept up a discussion on the advantages and disadvantages of isolation, till the very moment the Duncan dropped anchor about a mile off Amsterdam Island. This lonely group in the Indian Ocean consists of two distinct islands, 33 miles apart, and situated exactly on the meridian of the Indian Peninsula. To the north is Amsterdam Island, and to the south St. Paul, but they have been often confounded by geographers and navigators. At the time of the Duncan's visit to the island, the population consisted of 3 people, a Frenchman, and two mulattoes, all three employed by the merchant proprietor. Paganel was delighted to shake hands with a countryman in the person of good old Monsieur Viet. He was far advanced in years, but did the honors of the place with much politeness. It was a happy day for him when these kindly strangers touched at his island, for St. Peter S was only frequented by seal fishers, and now and then a whaler, the crews of which are usually rough, coarse men. M. Viet presented his subjects, the two mulattoes. They composed the whole living population of the island, except a few wild boars in the interior and myriads of penguins. The little house where the three solitary men lived was in the heart of a natural bay on the southeast, formed by the crumbling away of a portion of the mountain. Twice over in the early part of the century, Amsterdam Island became the country of deserted sailors, providentially saved from misery and death. But since these events, no vessel had been lost on its coast. Had any shipwreck occurred, some fragments must have been thrown on the sandy shore, and any poor sufferers from it would have found their way to M. Viet's fishing huts. The old man had been long on the island, and had never been called upon to exercise such hospitality. Of the Britannia and Captain Grant he knew nothing, but he was certain that the disaster had not happened on Amsterdam Island, nor on the islet called St. Paul, for whalers and fishing vessels went there constantly, and must have heard of it. Glenarvan was neither surprised nor vexed at the reply. Indeed, his object in asking was rather to establish the fact that Captain Grant had not been there than that he had. This done, they were ready to proceed on their voyage next day. They rambled about the island till evening, as its appearance was very inviting. Its fauna and flora, however, were poor in the extreme. The only specimens of quadrupeds, birds, fish, and cetacea were a few wild boars, stormy petrels, albatrosses, perch, and seals. Here and there thermal springs and chalybeate waters escaped from the black lava, and thin dark vapors rose above the volcanic soil. Some of these springs were very hot. John Mangles held his thermometer in one of them, and found the temperature was 176 degrees Fahrenheit. Fish caught in the sea a few yards off, cooked in 5 minutes in these all but boiling waters, a fact which made Paganel resolve not to attempt to bathe in them. Toward evening, after a long promenade, Glenarvan and his party bade adieu to the good old M. Viet, and returned to the yacht, wishing him all the happiness possible on his desert island, and receiving in return the old man's blessing on their expedition. Chapter 4: A Wager and How Decided. On the 7th of December, at 3 a.m., the Duncan lay puffing out her smoke in the little harbor ready to start, and a few minutes afterward the anchor was lifted, and the screw set in motion. By 8 o'clock, when the passengers came on deck, the Amsterdam Island had almost disappeared from view behind the mists of the horizon. This was the last halting place on the route, and nothing now was between them and the Australian coast but 3,000 miles distance. Should the west wind continue but a dozen days longer, and the sea remain favorable, the yacht would have reached the end of her voyage. Mary Grant and her brother could not gaze without emotion at the waves, through which the Duncan was speeding her course, when they thought that these very same waves must have dashed against the prow of the Britannia but a few days before her shipwreck. Here, perhaps, Captain Grant, with a disabled ship and diminished crew, had struggled against the tremendous hurricanes of the Indian Ocean, and felt himself driven toward the coast with irresistible force. The captain pointed out to Mary the different currents on the ship's chart, and explained to her their constant direction. Among others, there was one running straight to the Australian continent, and its action is equally felt in the Atlantic and Pacific. It was doubtless against this that the Britannia, dismasted and rudderless, had been unable to contend, and consequently been dashed against the coast and broken in pieces. A difficulty about this, however, presented itself. The last intelligence of Captain Grant was from Callao on the 30th of May, 1862, as appeared in the Mercantile and Shipping Gazette. How then was it possible that on the 7th of June, only 8 days after leaving the shores of Peru, that the Britannia could have found herself in the Indian Ocean? But to this, Paganel, who was consulted on the subject, found a very plausible solution. It was one evening, about 6 days after their leaving Amsterdam Island, when they were all chatting together on the poop, that the above-named difficulty was stated by Glenarvan. Paganel made no reply, but went and fetched the document. After perusing it, he still remained silent, simply shrugging his shoulders, as if ashamed of troubling himself about such a trifle. "Come, my good friend," said Glenarvan, "at least give us an answer." "No," replied Paganel, "I'll merely ask a question for Captain John to answer." "And what is it, Monsieur Paganel?" said John Mangles. Could a quick ship make the distance in a month over that part of the Pacific Ocean, which lies between America and Australia? Yes, by making 200 miles in 24 hours. Would that be an extraordinary rate of speed? Not at all. Sailing clippers often go faster. Well then, instead of 7 June on this document, suppose that one figure has been destroyed by the seawater, and read 17 June or 27 June, and all is explained. That's to say, replied Lady Helena, that between the 31st of May and the 27th of June, Captain Grant could have crossed the Pacific and found himself in the Indian Ocean. Paganel's theory met with universal acceptance. That's one more point cleared up, said Glenarvan. Thanks to our friend, all that remains to be done now is to get to Australia and look out for traces of the wreck on the western coast. Or the eastern, said John Mangles. Indeed, John, you may be right, for there is nothing in the document to indicate which shore was the scene of the catastrophe, and both points of the continent crossed by the 37th parallel must therefore be explored. Then, my lord, it is doubtful, after all, said Mary. Oh no, Miss Mary, John Mangles hastened to reply, seeing the young girl's apprehension. His lordship will please to consider that if Captain Grant had gained the shore on the east of Australia, he would almost immediately have found refuge and assistance. The whole of that coast is English, we might say, peopled with colonists. The crew of the Britannia could not have gone 10 miles without meeting a fellow countryman. I am quite of your opinion, Captain John, said Paganel. On the eastern coast, Harry Grant would not only have found an English colony easily, but he would certainly have met with some means of transport back to Europe. And he would not have found the same resources on the side we are making for? Asked Lady Helena. No, madam, replied Paganel. It is a desert coast, with no communication between it and Melbourne or Adelaide. If the Britannia was wrecked on those rocky shores, she was as much cut off from all chance of help as if she had been lost on the inhospitable shores of Africa. But what has become of my father there, then, all these 2 years? Asked Mary Grant. My dear Mary, replied Paganel, you have not the least doubt, have you, that Captain Grant reached the Australian continent after his shipwreck? No, Monsieur Paganel. Well, granting that, what became of him? The suppositions we might make are not numerous. They are confined to 3. Either Harry Grant and his companions have found their way to the English colonies, or they have fallen into the hands of the natives, or they are lost in the immense wilds of Australia. Go on, Paganel, said Lord Glenarvan, as the learned Frenchman made a pause. The first hypothesis I reject, then, to begin with, for Harry Grant could not have reached the English colonies, or long ago he would have been back with his children in the good town of Dundee. Poor father, murmured Mary, away from us for 2 whole years. Hush, Mary, said Robert, Monsieur Paganel will tell us. Alas, my boy, I cannot. All that I affirm is that Captain Grant is in the hands of the natives. But these natives, said Lady Helena hastily, are they? Reassure yourself, madam, said Paganel, divining her thoughts. The aborigines of Australia are low enough in the scale of human intelligence, and most degraded and uncivilized, but they are mild and gentle in disposition, and not sanguinary like their New Zealand neighbors. Though they may be prisoners, their lives have never been threatened, you may be sure. All travelers are unanimous in declaring that the Australian natives abhor shedding blood, and many a time they have found in them faithful allies in repelling the attacks of evil-disposed convicts, far more cruelly inclined. You hear what Monsieur Paganel tells us, Mary, said Lady Helena, turning to the young girl. If your father is in the hands of the natives, which seems probable from the document, we shall find him. And what if he is lost in that immense country? Asked Mary. Well, we'll find him still, exclaimed Paganel in a confident tone. Won't we, friends? Most certainly, replied Glenarvan, and anxious to give a less gloomy turn to the conversation, he added. But I won't admit the supposition of his being lost, not for an instant. Neither will I, said Paganel. Is Australia a big place? Inquired Robert. Australia, my boy, is about as large as 4/5 of Europe. It has somewhere about 775,000 hectares. So much as that, said the Major. Yes, McNabbs, almost to a yard's breadth. Don't you think now it has a right to be called a continent? I do, certainly. I may add, continued the savant, that there are but few accounts of travelers being lost in this immense country. Indeed, I believe Likert is the only one of whose fate we are ignorant, and some time before my departure, I learned from the Geographical Society that McIntyre had strong hopes of having discovered traces of him. The whole of Australia, then, is not yet explored? Asked Lady Helena. No, madam, but very little of it. This continent is not much better known than the interior of Africa, and yet it is from no lack of enterprising travelers. Fro to 1862, more than 50 have been engaged in exploring along the coast and in the interior. Oh, 50, exclaimed McNabbs incredulously. No, no, objected the major, that is going too far. And I might go farther, McNabbs, replied the geographer, impatient of contradiction. Yes, McNabbs, quite that number. Farther still, Paganel. If you doubt me, I can give you the names. Oh, oh, said the major coolly. That's just like you savants, you stick at nothing. Major, will you bet your Purtymore rifle against my telescope?